Whenever I hear mention of the Beatitudes, the first words that come to mind for me are, "Blessed are the poor in spirit," which is the first blessed that we hear in these Beatitudes. But I've been reading the Beatitudes for 2 or 3 weeks now, and as I've been reading them, I've been starting at verse 1 in Matthew 5, and I have remembered that there's a lead-in to these Beatitudes. We don't just start in with, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." First, we hear that Jesus is out and there's a crowd of people, and he goes up a mountain and sits down, and his disciples gather around, and he begins to speak to them and teaches them. When I think of teaching, when I think of my own learning, when someone is teaching me something, it means that there's something I did not already know or didn't fully understand, or there's a task or something that I don't know how to do. And then when someone is teaching me something, they're opening up new things and providing new opportunities for me to grow. All of that has me coming to these Beatitudes in this particular season of my life, asking, what is it that Jesus is trying to teach us? What words is he speaking into our lives that are supposed to open up something new? When I was a seminary intern, I was in Denver, Colorado, and a friend of mine, Pastor Nathan, had interned in that same place a few years before I did. And as we were in the middle of our time there, he said, "Do not leave Colorado without making John take you fly fishing." Now, in all my life, I had been fishing at that point maybe once at a lake with a little rod and reel from the shore. And so I went to John and said, "John, I'm supposed to have you take me fly fishing." So he drove me up into the Rocky Mountains on one of those fall days where when the sun was out, it was a little bit hot, but it was mostly nice and cool. And I don't know the proper term geographically for what we were in, but I don't know if you would call it a vale or a heather. But in the midst of the mountains, there was this big kind of flat plain, and off in the distance on every side, there were mountains rising up to meet the clouds. But that flatness was filled with wildflowers and vegetation, and right through the middle of it wound this just beautiful, idyllic stream. As soon as we parked, I just looked and thought how glorious it was. And just if that was the whole of the day, it would have been worth the trip. But John taught me how to do the basics of fly fishing. He had some waders for me because you stand in the stream and you cast this fly on the end of your line out into the water. And once he was convinced that I had the basic motion of that down, he went over to the stream and he got down and he started to look at the grass next to the stream. And I said, "John, what are you doing?" He said, "Well, these fish are smart. They know what kind of bugs are jumping around on any given day. And so if you put a fly on there as bait that doesn't look like the bugs that are jumping around, the fish won't bite. So the first thing you have to do is survey the environment and figure out what it is that is here that looks like food." So he put a fly on each of our rods at the end of the line, and we started to fish, and after a few minutes hadn't caught anything, and so he came back over with a different fly, and he said, "No, there's other bugs jumping around. We didn't pick the right one today." And so he swapped out the fly on my line, and pretty soon I caught a fish. And as I went on and got more comfortable, I actually got to a point where it almost felt like I was just swatting the water with the line. And he came along and said, "Listen, the fish are a little skittish. You got to be gentle." But then he taught me how to look at the stream. Like as this stream wound around, I just saw a stream. But what John saw was something different. He saw parts where the bank kind of hung over more than others, and there was an underside of that bank where the water was kind of deeper in, and the fish like to hide in those places. And he taught me how to see those sorts of things in the stream and know then that the fish might be there and that was a place to cast. So technically, John was teaching me how to fly fish, but really what I think John was teaching me was how to see and maybe even how to be in that environment in a very different way. I just saw the big glorious landscape that was before me, but John had me looking at the bugs and had me looking at the places in the stream that might be different than other places so that I might find where those fish are hiding. When we come to these Beatitudes and ask the question, what is it that Jesus is trying to teach us? I wonder if it's not that he's trying to teach us to see and maybe to be a different way in the world. I've always thought of the Beatitudes as kind of a list of kinds of people, right? There are people who are poor in spirit and people who are mourning and people who are meek and people who are peacemakers and merciful and persecuted. But if Jesus is inviting us to see and be differently in the same way that John was inviting me to see and be differently in that stream, maybe then these Beatitudes become more invitation than they are simply a list. And as an invitation, then we have to wonder, how is it then that we see and be differently? I come back to John, who was teaching me how to fly fish, but it turned out John was also a teacher. He was a professor. He worked in a research laboratory at a university and had at his fingertips, really, millions of dollars of equipment, I think, and all sorts of resources and people and connections that allowed him to teach and to do the work that he did. Well, along the way, someone invited John to go to Haiti. And when he got to Haiti, he found a whole group of people who didn't have access to even sort of the basic rudimentary health care that we might consider the simplest thing that we have. And the disparity between everything he had in his lab and in his profession and what he saw in this place of people with poverty and just absolutely nothing when it comes to those sorts of resources, it broke his heart a little bit. In fact, he kept going back and trying to find ways to bring medicines and other kinds of things to this group of people that they might be able to be more whole and well in the same way that he could see happening all around him in his day today. A couple of years ago here at Salem, we collected a bunch of socks and underwear and shorts and clothing to go to a local elementary school that is nearly, if not 100% free and reduced lunch kids who come from homes of poverty. And it's not always practical to take the whole church places, so there was just a couple of us that went to deliver those collected socks and underwear and shorts and stuff on a school day. And the first thing we did was meet the woman in the front office who checked people in. And when we showed her what we had, she was so grateful. And then we got to meet the principal who came out of her way to have a conversation with us. And then she introduced us to the guidance counselor who took us into her office where she had an entire cabinet dedicated to clothing like this. Because the reality is in that school, there are kids who have maybe one set of clothes. And if on the playground one day something gets torn or dirtied or they have an accident, they don't always have something else to put on. They have children who have a hole in their shoe that's this big that is always in their shoe because it's the only shoes they have. They have kids that don't eat every day if they don't come to school. And as soon as you start to talk to the guidance counselor and the principal and some of the teachers, you get a sense that the whole of that place has had their hearts broken for the struggles that they see in these kids every day. I know another teacher who grew up in a fairly affluent, sort of white suburban community and has become a high school teacher and primarily serves as a teacher in a community that is African-American kids that are more economically disadvantaged. And coming from her background, she now has built these relationships, wonderful relationships with these kids who have experienced our world in a whole different way than she has. And so as our world has been stirred up with conversations about racism and protests and all of the rest of it, she is beginning to experience it not through her own lenses, but starting to empathize and see through their lenses how some of that feels. And I got to tell you, it's broken her heart. And so whether it's she teaching high school or John in a university or a whole elementary school full of teachers, these are not tasks that they set out to do, right? They didn't set out and say, I'm going to go have my heart broken for the poverty and the brokenness in our world. No, they just answered an invitation to go to Haiti, a job offer to become a teacher in a place. And in that process then, they had their hearts broken. And I wonder if what Jesus is not doing in his Beatitudes is giving us that same kind of invitation. And often that invitation looks like crossing boundaries to be amongst people who are different than we are. That's what happened to John and the teachers at the school and this other teacher, right? They're crossing boundaries. So often as people, we like to clump together in likeness. And whether that likeness is our economics or that likeness is our ethnicity or our skin color or that likeness is a shared experience of growing up in a community or a shared interest in something particular, we like to and are comfortable in that space of likeness. It's just what people do. But then when we encounter something that's different, and that difference can land in all of those places. It can be economically different, socially different, ethnically different. When we land in those places of difference, it makes us pause because that different thing is unknown to us, and unknowns can put us in places of fear and hesitation. And so what we hear in these Beatitudes is perhaps this invitation to see the environment differently, right? And to be in the world differently, to understand that those boundaries can be crossed and that we can go into these different places. And we just might find that the bugs next to the stream tell us something about the fish, and that the fish that are hiding under the bank, right? People are hiding or hidden from us all the time and left out of all of the grace that we would share and the prosperity that is around us. And these Beatitudes then become an invitation to see and be in those places differently. Now, this is exactly what Jesus does when he has his earthly ministry. He crosses boundaries all the time. There's the great story of him sitting at the well with the Samaritan woman, where he shouldn't have been talking to a woman by himself, and he certainly shouldn't have been talking to a Samaritan woman. And yet Jesus goes and has this deep conversation. There's the stories of Jesus approaching people that are possessed by demons when everyone else would cast them out of town and leave them be. There's the lepers who approach Jesus, and he doesn't turn them away. He gets accused of dining with tax collectors, even calls one to be one of his disciples. He gets accused of spending time with prostitutes, and all of the people that are on the fringes of the culture across those boundaries of decency and whatever the culture defined as kind of what's right and well. And yet Jesus crosses those boundaries again and again. And what we see when Jesus crosses those boundaries is that he has very human interactions, right? He has mercy and compassion on those people, but he also sits in that grief. There's a wonderful passage later in the gospel where Jesus says, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how I have longed to gather you like a mother hen gathers her chicks." And what I hear in that from Jesus is a grief that all of this grace and gift of life that he has brought, that it's just not landing. We're told that there's places where Jesus went and he could do no deeds of power because the people didn't believe. And I think Jesus mourned that because he so wanted people to connect to this gift of grace and life that he brought. So that by the time Jesus gets to the cross, he has lived all of these Beatitudes. He has mourned with grief for what hasn't been. He's had mercy. He's been pure of heart. He's been persecuted, right? That's what the cross is. And he doesn't fight back from the cross. He's meek on that cross and humble and gentle. So that Jesus embodies all of these Beatitudes, not as a list of people, but as a way of being in the world. And they then become for us an invitation to see around us and to be differently so that we might follow his path that he has laid out and live in that space. Now, we're not always so good at this. Every day we get messages from our culture that tell us the exact opposite of the Beatitudes. We're not supposed to be poor in spirit. We're supposed to be self-assured and confident. We're not supposed to spend a bunch of time mourning, right? We're supposed to move on. We're not supposed to be meek. We're supposed to be strong and aggressive and to take what is ours and to be successful and prosperous and to work to pull ourselves into those places. We hear this every day in so many ways, that mercy is a weakness and compassion is a weakness and making peace is pointless, right? We have to fight for everything that is ours. That is what we hear all the time, and yet Jesus is speaking to us saying, no, blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those who mourn, blessed are the meek. And what we hear then in the other part of the Beatitudes is what happens is that, right, there's all of this blessed, but then Jesus tells us what it means to be blessed. It means that the kingdom of heaven is near. It means that you will inherit the earth. It means that we will see God. What Jesus is saying is that this invitation to a different way of living is an invitation to being present with God here and now in this world. And that presence of God being something that shapes and changes and molds our lives in such amazing and wonderfully fruitful ways. But I was on that mountain fly fishing, right, tempted to just see the glory of it all. And John had to invite me to see and be differently, to really experience the deep glory of the creation and the bugs in the stream and the hiddenness of the fish. And so it is that we are invited to see the environment and see people and find people and share God's love as we go. Now, part of me wants to say, I'm not sure we do a very good job at that. And I'm actually certain that we don't always do a good job of that. But it is the Holy Spirit that works in us and through us and among us to make this happen. And I know that we can do it because I've seen it. Today is All Saints' Day. We celebrate the saints who have passed. I've done a lot of funerals and memorial services over the years. And when I prepared to do one of those, I usually ask the family to just share some stories of their loved ones. Now, there are times where someone has been mean and nasty all their life, and that's what the family remembers. But even in some of the most broken situations that I have dealt with at the time of death, when I ask that question, the things they talk about live in the space of these Beatitudes. They'll talk about how mom was gentle or how dad was kind, how their uncle never said a bad word about anybody, and how they were merciful. All that sort of language. They may not use the exact words of the Beatitudes, but what they remember of their loved ones is that they touched their lives in some way. And I think that is part of that presence of God. When we can be seen and known and loved, then we know God is with us. So I know that we can do this, but I also know not only can we do it, but that the world deeply needs it. As we gather here on this Sunday, we are just 2 days out from Election Day. And there's been voting going on for weeks now in lots of different places. And if you think about it, I can pose this as a question. When you look at our media and our debates and our conversation with neighbors who disagree with us, do you see the Beatitudes? Do you see poorness of spirit and meekness and gentleness and mercy and all of what's gathered up in this invitation Jesus gives us? I would guess not. We see the opposite, right? We see the aggressiveness and the people defending their need to be right, while the Beatitudes invite us to trust in God's righteousness and to hunger and thirst for it, right? And so as we head towards Tuesday, we've been immersed in the opposite of the Beatitudes, and this invitation is for us to live in a different way. It's counterintuitive and it is hard to do, but the Spirit is the one who does it with us. Now, I don't know what's going to happen on Tuesday. I don't know how that's all going to turn out, but there are some things I do know. I know that on the road right out here from our congregation, in the 5 years that I've been here, there's a homeless woman who lives out there. And she's probably out there today, and come Wednesday, no matter how that election turns, she'll still be there. I know that there's a hotel not too far from us that is full of families who are homeless. Some of them due to circumstances outside of their control, some of them due to their own financial choices. There's so many families there that our school here in the county sends a bus there at lunch to feed those families when school is not fully in session, right? Because there are that many hungry kids in that building. That's true today, and that will still be true on Wednesday. There are people who are in hospice today and people that will enter into hospice on Wednesday, and people who are struggling with chronic illnesses and the death of loved ones, and all of that will still be true on Wednesday. The invitation we get from these Beatitudes is not to get caught up in the power and the control and the arguing about who gets to decide what is, and instead to enter into the places where we will find God. Not that we have to seek God out, but that God is already present among us. And this is where we get the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn, the meek, the merciful, those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, those who make peace, those who are pure of heart. I don't think we actually get to that state on our own. Just as John was teaching me to see and be, and just as he had his heart broken, I think what happens is we hear these words from Jesus, we experience this grace of God, and we find ourselves deeply immersed in the lives of others around us, and we can't help but have our heart broken for what breaks God's heart. And then we do find ourselves in the place of those Beatitudes, and we find ourselves blessed by God's presence, a gift to us and a gift for us to share with the world as we go. That day, John taught me how to look at the stream and to look at the bugs and to see the glory of it all. And my prayer for us this week is that we can see the glory of all of God's creation in the hidden people among us, in the brokenness among us, and to trust that it is in those places that God's grace fills us up and carries us along. Amen.